Please welcome on stage Inge Bekkevold, Senior China Fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies.
It's good to see that quite a few people still left. We have no illusions. We know that it's because of the lunch, but we will we will try to do our best at the last panel. As was introduced, the topic is about U.S.-Asia policy and implications for Europe. The fact that we have Kaush Arha in our panel, he was also in another panel yesterday on a slightly different topic, but the fact that you are in two panels, I think it's actually a good example of what this panel is all about, because the purpose of this panel is to sort of highlight how the Asian and European strategic theaters are connected to each other. And I know that you've been working on both flanks. The US has two flanks, and in Europe we sometimes tend to forget that the United States also has another flank across the Pacific that is equally important for US policy. So we're very glad to have you on this topic as well. Simón, with the Freie University in Brussels, is heading a very good group of scholars working on strategy and geopolitics. We're very glad to have you in this panel as well. And Øystein Tursjø, who is a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, where I'm also working. Before I sort of give the word to you, Kaush, again, let me emphasize that Europe and Asia are connected. This was the fact during the Second World War. The very thing that brought the US into the Second World War was Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. In the early phase of the Second World War, the Soviet Union provided substantial military support to China. But as soon as Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1949, they withdrew their support to focus on their European flank. Again, during the Cold War, Nixon and Kissinger playing the China card against the Soviet Union also had implications for the end of the Cold War. And again today, we are seeing that these theaters are connected, so that's the very topic we are discussing. So, Kaush, I would like to start by asking you to elaborate a little bit on the Trump administration's Asia-China policy, because over the last few weeks, the Trump administration has released both its national security strategy as well as its defense strategy. And if you read these strategy papers carefully, there is a lot of hardcore balance of power and geopolitics actually in there. So we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts on are these strategy papers sort of in line with the long-standing US grand strategy, or is it a substantial deviation from US strategy?
Thank you very much, and it's a real honor again to be here. Appreciate it deeply. The short answer is that it's in line with the strategy. But if I may beg your indulgence, just to make two comments, because I think the panel this morning was, to me, the best panel I've seen in a long time, not only here but other places, because it was real. And I think it deserves an answer. So I think it would be responsible to sort of in the theme of this thing, if you would invite me. I'd say two comments, and then I'll get into this. First and foremost, Stein is not here, and I think it's appropriate to say that a heartfelt apology to Denmark, and perhaps extended to all Nordic countries, in the way we have sort of spoken and talked about Greenland. As I've said yesterday, it was unwarranted, unfair, and unhelpful. Greenland and the Greenlanders' self-determination is inviolate. So I think that should be clear. It also should be very clear of how important and critical Greenland is to American security. It is not helpful, I think. Again, I'm not taking anything away from our contribution to this. But no, it is not sort of President Trump's personal ambition on Greenland. It has been a topic of American security going back a century and more. All you have to look at the map. And we have a difference of understanding than the good admiral about the threats we perceived on the northern end when China is concerned, a lot to do with what French had to say about the new way of doing. And just looking at it, the capacity of only what Russia has today is a static way, a dynamic way of looking at it, and also looking at how much we have underestimated China, whether it's naval, whether it's everything. So the notion that with both good generals, admire them, but couldn't disagree more, that today I see my life this way and I don't see a threat. We have a completely and substantially a different perspective. And it is also remarkable that French asked you to look at 50 years, 30, 40 years, and the argument, and rather flippant argument, both made in this room and by the idiots in CNN to say, I go around Greenland, I don't see any Chinese ship. What the bloody, it's not a question of Chinese ships today. It is about tomorrow. And you're spending a lot of time saying how I'm going to focus, but we are not doing service to each other in talking in such flippant manner on both ends. And if tomorrow would happen to be an issue on Greenland, as you talked about, you may barely meet the capacity of handling from Norway to UK, from Azores to Marspat. There is in no world the capacity that Europe has to protect Greenland. It is literally an American responsibility, today, tomorrow, and day after. Our Canadians are not there, good friends. They're good friends as they are, good friends they shall remain. But their capacity, so it is truly a very, very important issue. And so they're equally important. The inviolate nature of self-determination, sovereignty of Greenland, and American interest in Greenland are equally important. Push come to shove. There's only one answer to them. If there was the war, the worst-case scenario that you are doing, there's only one answer to it. And so I think it is important that we address it. And the situation is always more complicated than that. I myself was involved in the first Trump and the next Trump, and I would not in any way violate the trust and the faith and the confidence of my Greenland friends. But the Greenlanders and Americans both wanted a more structured arrangement in Greenland for the amount of investment needed, both sides. And we completely have lost the Greenlanders because of our unhelpful rhetoric. In fact, I was the one when these overtures were made. In the middle of it, I said, the deal that we're going to make with Greenland is not in Nuuk, but in Copenhagen. I shall not make a deal with Greenlanders because at the cost of the tremendously true, trusted, long-serving alliance and responsibility we have with Denmark. So things are more complicated and should not. We do a disservice to each other by relegating it to flippant statement back and forth. But it does no way abrogate our responsibility and our caricature and how we have treated it. So for that, you have my heartfelt apology. The second issue, I think, is inherently related to the Indo-Pacific, and this is I think I spoke yesterday and I got a lot of response that, the conflict value stuff, interest value. So you have to say, where are America and Europe the strongest when we are fully aligned? World War II and Cold War. That's when we were truly, there was no confusion. We didn't talk about values. We were just there because we really needed each other. George Washington said earlier, when in 1776, that the young republic would be better around the world if we were surrounded with democracies than authoritarianism. That's true in 1776, it's true today. The strongest point I have about America is the American ideal and the America idea, not our strength. That was true tomorrow, true yesterday, true in the future. Having said all that, the strongest we were when we had a shared enemy, whether it was the Nazis in 45 or it was the communist Russia. This alliance of ours went little bit soft after 1989 and 90. We kind of took upon ourselves almost like a white man's burden to sort of do the good in the world, whether it be climate change, and a lot of good stuff happened with the whole President Bush in Africa. But that is what the baggage of values is today for us, and we hear about it a lot. But let's take it what really that meant for us. During that time, Ukraine wanted to be a NATO member. We said no. Where was the value of sovereignty then? Where were these individual countries wanted to? And we said, not we, actually, I would point to my good friends on that end of the table. It wasn't values, it was interest. When people said, no, I just think we ought not to be stoking the bear. Let's cut it this way, that way, whichever way we got to do it. 2007 happened. 2008 happened in Georgia. 2014 happened. We made exceptions. If Mr. Zelensky had not left and stayed in Kiev, but had gone on to a government in exile, as most of us thought, we would be in a completely different discussion of values and discussions. So this issue of interest-based stuff comes up. A person like me earlier on said, we are an ideological enemy of Russia and China. The China tells me, has clear to say that we are their ideological enemy. I said, let's make it a value proposition, because to beat China, we would need not only a whole of America, whole of Allied rallying of it. We cannot do it in systemic rival and strategic competitors, some sort of a corporate conversation. We have to say good and bad. We had to say it. The value people said, no, I don't think so. That's too much. So we didn't go for value then. Then we have an issue all over with the same mouth. Europe has, every time I come, this is not every American, whoever comes here, there's only one question. Are you going to be there for Article 5? Are you going to be really there when it really counts? Or are you going to be there when Article 5 happens? But we Europeans are caught between America and China. What value are we talking about? Well, you should be there, you should come, America come here between Europe and Russia and protect us, but woe us, poor Europe, which is caught between China and what value?
Kaush, may I ask you a question?
I'll conclude in 1 minute and I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. 1 minute.
Okay. So I think then it comes to this particular issue, and now it comes to, and nobody understands this better, in fact, on both sides of the Atlantic, than Ursula von der Leyen. She has said many times that we are on the same side of the table. Let's discuss this, whether it's China and Russia. But now we have people, like good old Carney, who says, okay, if America I don't like what it's doing, I'm going to make a B road to Beijing. So don't like us to do help with Russia, so you're going to go to the enabler of Russia, then come back and give a lecture on rupture and responsibility. So at some level, and I want to leave it with this, if you are a Eurosceptic American and you come to these conferences, and I want you to be the Eurosceptic American, not me, and then you hear the conference of yesterday and today, and you go back home, and you say, I am convinced they are there, they're worthy, or you will still remain skeptical. I leave it to you. I think the panel before that would change my mind about the realism and discussion. And that gets into, I think, a good way to look at it of the Indo-Pacific, because this view that I just shared is sort of inculcated and permeated through those two documents. And it's useful to have it as we go into engaging what Europe's role in Indo-Pacific is. So I apologize for going over, but I thought it needed to be said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll pose one question to you, Kaush. Before I give the floor to you, Øystein, I would like to ask you one question, because you're talking about values and interests. During the Cold War, the United States had a containment strategy vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. And the containment strategy was about both interests and values. It was military containment and also economic containment, and ideology was a very important part of it. But when I'm reading the new national security strategy and the defense strategy from the current Trump administration, I see a difference between US approach to China today and US approach to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Because I see that you are searching for a military containment of China, but not economic containment. I don't find that in the document. So it seems that it's more interest-based and less value-based in your approach to China today than what was the case during the Cold War. So very, very short response.
Answer is no, but I think the language is missing. But if you looked at the national security strategy, one of the important part is that economic diplomacy has been elevated to a very high level. So I think the word economic security, economic diplomacy has I think they explicitly say containment is not the word they would like to use. They go again and again in that particular issue. And I think what you will find is that there are, if you read both the strategies, if you miss the rhetoric, read the strategy just on paper, it's both consistent with American policy for previous administration. It still has a problem, which my biggest criticism was, does not explicitly recognize the China-Russia axis and then respond to it. It chooses explicitly not to do so. Going forward, it uses two very important, I'll give you the punchline, what the answer, and then you can spend the time you get. I think you will find by the 3 years a global quad for economic security. Just because, again, these are where we need to be, not necessarily, they need to be. A very important thing happened today. US-India trade deal got affirmed. Very big deal. India-EU FTA got also affirmed. Very, very big deal. We have the best prime minister in Japan. Big deal. I would find that the top 4 out of the 5 economies will increasingly work together as a G4 of economic security going forward. This is where I think would be happening by end of 2023. Similarly, you would have the word again and again used in NSC, collective security, in the term of Indo-Pacific. So it's very odd that America comes here and lectures Europeans for don't you do enough? And then Indo-Pacific, it is one-way security assurances to every Indo-Pacific country. It is a remarkable asymmetry. And it's just and NATO is the best thing since sliced bread. It is the best down alliance, everything, and nobody will walk away because everybody walks away at its own peril, including America. So, and we're not going to create NATO in Indo-Pacific, but I think there are tenets of an Indo-Pacific treaty organization increasingly because of exactly the issues we talked about. It's just too much for one entity to do. It's a lot better if we work collectively. And so you'll have a rise of an Indo-Pacific treaty organization and a collective sort of G4 economic security. That's where we would head. Believe me, there's nobody who bleeds more for value than I do. I'm just saying values are for two people can see two different things for value and mean the same. Interests are much easier to come to grips with what they are, and you can always put value. The value is inbuilt in it. I'm a democracy. I'm not changing not to be a democracy. Europe hopefully remains a democracy. That is an inherent value. I can coach any each way. We democracies are better off together than authoritarianism. I don't care what the damn document says. That's the hard fact.
Thank you. We will come back to China and the Arctic later in the panels. We will not forget that topic, but I would like to give the floor to you, Øystein, please.
Thank you, Inge. First, let me thank Kate and Camilla and the whole crew for organizing yet another excellent conference here in Oslo, and for bringing me back at the stage here. That's great. And there are many friends I see in the audience, so what I will be saying won't be that much surprise to many of you. But my sort of core arguments are that we have entered a world centered on Asia, where power is concentrated in the 21st century, and we also have entered a new US-China superpower rivalry, whereby Europe needs to take much more responsibility for its security in its own region. Several US strategies from the Obama administration and onwards have pointed to this global power shift, and now it is clearly articulated in the Trump administration national security strategy and the national defense strategy. And the US will no longer seek to be the dominating world power as it did during primacy and unipolarity. Instead, it will emphasize dominating the Western Hemisphere. And when looking to balance power in any other region, the US will prioritize East Asia simply because China will dominate that region without a strong US presence. Despite Trump's statements and actions that have undermined transatlantic relations, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy state that the US will continue to support its allies in Europe. But since Russia is nowhere near the threat as China, Europe will need to take the primary responsibility for balancing Russia and sustaining stability and security in Europe. This is a US grand strategy for a new superpower rivalry with China. And in many speeches and much writings, we often hear about great power rivalry and great power competition. But who are these great powers? The short answer is that we don't have a great power rivalry in the world today. For a start, we should ask, when was the US degraded from a superpower to a great power? That has not happened. The EU and the US had about the same GDP roughly 20 years ago. Now, the EU, not Germany or whoever you think is a great power in Europe, the entire EU has now about 70% of the US GDP. So the gap has only increased. And the US economy is about 12 times Russia's economy. It's 7 times India and Japan's economy. The only power that has shifted the distribution of power in the international system is China. China has gone from having about 1% of the world's GDP in the early 1990s to having about 18% today. The US economy in the early 1990s was 15 times larger than China's economy. Today, China has about 65% of the US economy. China has risen far above all of the states contending for top ranking. Its economy is about 8 times the size of Russia, and its power by far surpasses any other top-ranking contender. Indeed, the international system has never been more bipolar than today. The power gap between the US and China is narrower today than between the US and the Soviet Union. And the power gap between China and any third-ranking power is greater today than during the Cold War. In comparing the two bipolar systems, it is interesting to note the following. China won against the US in the Korean War, but the international system did not change from bipolarity to multipolarity or great power rivalry. Today, Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. Strikingly, Japan's economy surpassed that of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But it was still a bipolar system and a superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. No state is even close to surpassing China's economy today. If we look at a classic book like Paul Kennedy's The Rise and the Fall of the Great Powers, page 171, we can see what a multipolar system with great powers look like. There were some variation, but from 1830 to 1890, Russia, Great Britain, Germany, and France had roughly the same GDP, and none had even twice as large GDP as the other great power. So the distribution of power in the international system today is not even close to the 19th century great power rivalry. It is instead a bipolar system with two superpowers. And this matters not simply because we need to get the facts right, but international politics would have looked very different if there was a great power rivalry and not a US-China superpower rivalry. Just imagine if Russia had close to the GDP of US and China, or if France and Germany had anything close to the GDP of China and the US today. That would have been a great power rivalry, and the world would have been completely different from what it is today. At the same time, the current superpower rivalry differs from the Cold War. As my colleague, Professor Henrik Him, and I argued in an article in the journal International Security last year, because the US and China are confronting each other in the maritime domain and not on land, the role of nuclear weapons differs in this new superpower rivalry, which heightens the risk of a limited war in East Asia compared to the Cold War in Europe. From history, we know that the war in the Pacific or East Asia will have a major impact on Europe. If there is a war in East Asia in the years to come, then this presents Russia with an opportunity to launch a new war in Europe. European states therefore need to invest in defense, both because the US will prioritize the rivalry with China and downgrade its presence in Europe, and because a potential war between the US and China could have spillover effects on Europe. The current superpower rivalry is not only shaped by different geopolitical and military developments. Contemporary international politics is not polarized as during the Cold War. Instead of an East-West divide, decoupling, embargo, and blockades that characterized the Cold War, the contemporary superpower rivalry and state interaction is better characterized as conflictual coexistence. Trade and technology cooperation are still high, but at the same time, there are trade conflicts, sanctions, and export and import controls on technology. There are ideological differences and rival systems of government, but the world is not divided into a democratic capitalist versus a communist camp as during the Cold War. The differences allow for different strategies. The US and China are balancing each other militarily, but not in the same way as the Soviet Union and the US. And in this new superpower rivalry, US allies in Asia and Europe do not need to choose side in the same way as during the Cold War. They have more freedom to maneuver. They can pursue hedging strategies. On the one hand, European states can hedge against the US by seeking to maintain the transatlantic alliance, but at the same time ensure against abandonment and growing confrontation with the US. On the other hand, European states can hedge against China, acknowledging that trade and engagement with China is still in Europe's interest, but simultaneously ensure against Chinese dominance and cohesion and Beijing's support for Russia. Moreover, European states can hedge with Indo-Pacific partners by diversifying away from the US and China. However, Europe needs to ensure against security entrapment in the Asia-Pacific, a region that is not vital to Europe. Taken together, and in conclusion, in the shadow of a new US-China superpower rivalry, these hedging strategies can put European states in a better position to maneuver in a new bipolar system and simultaneously deter and balance Russia, which should be our main security goal in Europe.
Thank you, Øystein. Again, before I give the word to you, Luis, I would like to pose one or two questions to you, Øystein. Britain's Prime Minister brought a delegation to Beijing just a few days ago. So, in your hedging approach to as a strategy or policy for Europe, do you foresee that a number of European countries will continue and perhaps potentially also deepen their dialogue and cooperation with China? It's because, of course, because what you're saying now, that this is based on balance of power, and then already based on balance of power, you could expect Europe to have perhaps a closer dialogue with China than what was the case during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But in addition to that, it's also the recent policies of the Trump administration. So my question to you, how close will Europe's relationship with China be, and how close should it be, in your view?
So I would agree with my good American friend there, that of course we should not reward China for their support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Of course not. But what are the Germans going to do? China is their biggest trading partner. I mean, you can't just stop trading with China. So this is very different from the situation with the Soviet Union, where you had the COCOM and you had the complete sort of divide between the East and the West. So because China doesn't have the geopolitical outreach like the Soviet Union, geographically China is not reaching into Europe or even the Middle East. Europe is in a different position, where they're not threatened by China in the same way as Europe was threatened by the Soviet Union during the previous superpower rivalry. And this allows them to continue to trade with China, but at the same time they should, of course, seek to hedge their bets and not become too dependent on China. They should basically follow what China's been doing over the last 10 years. The Made in China 2025 strategy is a strategy to be more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, increase your technology. I mean, this is basically a strategy that Europe should follow. And how did China do Made in China 2025? It was not by decoupling from Europe or the US or Japan or India, or they were trading, they were investing, but at the same time they were absolutely putting security as their primary sort of goal, and security through developing their own technology, security through developing their minerals, chips, not becoming too dependent on the US or Europe. And basically we should do the same. And in doing that, we cannot sort of decouple from China.
This is a topic I would like to revert to later, but I think we should bring Luis into the configuration and to sort of elaborate a little bit more on Europe's approach and potential cooperation with not only with China but also other countries in Asia.
Thanks, Inge, and thank you for the invite. Indeed, just a few thoughts from my side, following up on some of what was said already, on how the deterrence and alliance architectures of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific intersect at a time of strategic simultaneity, which is of course a concept that's underlined in the National Defense Strategy. And we mentioned that yesterday already during his first visit to Europe back in February last year. Secretary of War, Defense, Pentagon Chief, Pete Hegseth, said that as the US prioritizes deterrent war with China in the Indo-Pacific, that Europeans would need to lead from the front, take primary responsibility, what have you, right? And he's actually been repeating that ever since, quite consistently, I would say. And we talked about that yesterday plenty. And I think that sort of vision underscores the importance of strategic prioritization and has, I would say, led the Trump administration to reframe the war in Ukraine as a drain in US strategic bandwidth and resources, right? And I think that kind of thinking contrasts quite sharply, I would say, with what we heard, we in Europe heard from the Biden administration over the last 4 years. previous 4 years. The argument back then was that by supporting Ukraine, the US could even derive strategic payoffs in the context of competition with China as well, right? That there was no zero-sum game. Because by standing up for global norms, values, whenever and wherever they might be challenged, the US and the international community would also send a powerful signal, deterrent signal, if you will, to Beijing, that would lead China to think twice before making a move on Taiwan or any other state, right? That was at least the logic that the Biden administration laid out. So I think it's clear that the Biden and Trump two administrations actually share their understanding that the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific intersect strategically in very important ways. It's just that they frame that intersection in very different terms, right, and draw very different conclusions. So the Biden administration underscored global norms. It sort of portrayed or treated China and Russia both as hostile and as cohesive, or relatively cohesive, and promoted cooperation between US allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific. And the Trump 2 administration seems to be challenging every single one of those premises, right? The Indo-Pacific is identified as the decisive theater, perhaps more clearly in the NDS, and Europe as a secondary theater. There is also less inclination to treat China and Russia as a bloc. And there is also less interest in promoting cross-theater cooperation between US allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, right? And a clear preference for dealing with allies bilaterally, even within each of those two regions. So I think to make sense of all of this conceptually, because I mean, it keeps, you know, how the US thinks about the intersection between these two regions can vary, right? Across, and it has varied across and within administrations, I would say. So I think to make sense of all of this conceptually, I try to think of sort of three ideal types of thinking about how the deterrence and alliance architectures of Europe and the Indo-Pacific intersect in this day and age. I would call them bifurcation, cooperation, and integration. Bifurcation, and I think the Trump administration in some ways might be closer to this, although not entirely, these are ideal types. Bifurcation entails treating Europe and the Indo-Pacific as separate theaters strategically and maintaining a regional approach to defense strategy, to deterrence, and to alliance management, exclusively regional. It calls for a clear distinction between the China and the Russia threats and suggests that the US should focus on the bigger threat and deprioritize, if not accommodate, the lesser threat. And that has advantages because it allows for a much more tailored competitive strategy against China, but it can also come at the cost of strategic flexibility, right? And Tom Mankin and others have been writing about that. Then I think bifurcation also underscores the fact that US allies in the Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are actually competing for US attention and resources, right? So it's more of a zero-sum dynamic. Then cooperation, which would be this sort of the second model, entails trying to reconcile or balance the fact that security threats are primarily regional with the recognition that strategic dynamics in Europe and in the Pacific are somewhat intertwined, and you mentioned China enabling, right? Which is something that both the Biden and Trump administration have actually, to some extent, acknowledged. Somewhat being the operative word, right? So I think here, fostering some cooperation between US allies in Europe and Asia might make sense, but only as long as it is clear that the main focus of US allies should be on their respective regions, and that cooperation does not divert operational resources away from their respective regions. And finally, integration would represent a more radical departure from current debates, although some people like Admiral Stavridis have been advocating for that, and it would entail treating Europe and the Indo-Pacific more or less as a single theater of operations, conceiving of China and Russia as a bloc, even though we know that there are frictions, but treating them as a bloc, because that sort of simplifies your life and your operational picture, and developing a unified approach to managing alliances and deterrence across both regions. That doesn't necessarily mean that European allies and Indo-Pacific allies should extend to each other mutual defense commitments, but it would require much stronger links between both alliance ecosystems in terms of in areas like command and control, intelligence sharing, or even defense planning, right? So the question is why and under which circumstances each of these three, or one of these three ideal type approaches is likely to prevail. And I think that hinges on a number of factors, like domestic politics in the United States, allied preferences in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, the intensity of the threat, of course, in both regions, and of course the level of coordination between China and Russia. And I think the fact that the center of gravity of the China threat and the Russia threat is regional rather than global, I think incentivizes US allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific to concentrate primarily on their respective regions. This is something that the Trump administration has been raising repeatedly. I actually think that most Europeans, Japanese, Australians actually agree with that. And that follows a bifurcation logic, if you will. However, and I think this is where it gets interesting, I would say that notwithstanding all the differences in strategic geography, Asia being an air-sea theater, and Europe a predominantly air-land one, Norway and the high north notwithstanding, I think Europe, so with all those differences and caveats, I would say that US allies in the Atlantic and in the Pacific actually face a strikingly similar problem, namely how to implement deterrence by denial in their home regions against a nuclear-armed peer adversary that's intent on constraining US access. We actually have the same external security guarantor, and achieving local escalation dominance so as to break the alliance ecosystem, right? And that actually underscores the potential for synergies when it comes to concepts of operations, with all the differences: capability development, industrial development, technologies, standards, and so on, right? So I think here it might be useful to distinguish between the sort of downstream and upstream aspects of deterrence, if you will, downstream being the more operational, force posture related aspects, and upstream about the generation of the concepts, capabilities, and technologies and skill sets and doctrines that underpin deterrence. And I think that focusing upstream here could allow the US and its allies in Europe and NATO IP4, if you want to take that jargon, to move towards some sort of cross-theater ecosystem of shared capabilities, technologies, industrial solutions, and standards that A, bolsters deterrence by denial in their respective regions, and actually respects the bottom line and the principle of focusing operationally on their respective regions. So it doesn't challenge that principle, right? And I think that could help us, going back to the previous conversation, I think the Admiral was raising that, by simplifying standards and the number of systems, not only within Europe, but within the broader allied ecosystem in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, and reducing the number of systems, of platforms and munitions produced, for instance, by NATO and IP4 allies, that could potentially yield very significant gains in terms of efficiency, scale, and speed of delivery. By the way, these are all DOW buzzwords today. So it's a Doge, but thinking big about Doge, if you will, right? And that would actually leave the US and its allies, and going back, and I couldn't agree more, that to compete effectively with China, which is ultimately the main ball game, you need scale, right? And I think that sort of thinking would allow the US and its allies to outproduce, or I don't know if outproduce, but at least to match in terms of production and outmatch. And I think their respective competitors, and I think that's particularly important in a context of prolonged military and industrial competition and eventually even protraction.
Thank you, Luis. Listening to you, there is many interesting takeaways, but one important takeaway actually I think is related to your term bifurcation. Is you're actually saying that both Russia and China are regional threats, first and foremost. But still you...
From a military perspective.
From a military...
China, from a broader geopolitical perspective, is a broader threat.
Exactly.
Yes, a broader challenge.
But still there is a potential for collaboration, to deepen collaboration between US allies, NATO countries in Europe, and the P4 partner countries in Asia. Could you sort of expand a little bit on what type of cooperation that... because already we see an increased contact. But how do you foresee European countries moving forward, deepening defense cooperation? I'm talking about the security side of it, with Japan, South Korea, and Australia in particular.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I've been following the NATO IP4 conversation quite closely over the last 5 years. It got a lot of traction with Biden, as you know, after Madrid, and then Washington, and Vilnius and Washington. And it got a lot of traction, and suddenly last year in The Hague, it sort of went a little bit downhill. But I think if there is something that my sense is that the current U.S. administration, it's not wild about promoting that conversation, but it actually agrees that there is a space for cooperation between U.S. allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific when it comes to defense industry and technological innovation, right? So I think that is primarily the landing zone in terms of the NATO IP4. I think it's getting more granular, and it's time we unpack that, because as I was saying, U.S. allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and the U.S. in Europe and the Indo-Pacific itself, because it's in both theaters, face a similar predicament, but it's also different in many ways, because the geography is different, the distances are different. So, we're trying to implement a strategy of deterrence by denial, for instance, right? Which is sort of increasingly embraced by most U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, as well as in a NATO context, right? That calls for similar sets of operational concepts, even similar capabilities. There's a big interest in air and missile defense, for instance. But of course, the ranges that you need, the delivery platforms that you need are different, because you're talking about more of an air-sea operational context over there, more of a land or air-land one over here. So I think what we need to do right now in the coming months and coming years is to have more granularity into that discussion, because there is space for cooperation based on the fact that we are looking at similar sets of strategic and operational problems, but we can't cooperate in every single area, right? So we need to identify where the synergies are, probably more in the air domain, which is what both regions have most in common. But there are also some, there's also some potential for cooperation in things like missile defense, certainly cyber, all those things that are less wedded to geography as well. Of course, cyberspace. So I think this is where we need to go in terms of the conversation, more granularity.
But you're not foreseeing European troops, vessels, airplanes taking part in a theater-limited war in Asia. You're foreseeing more a cooperation on defense industry side.
That I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. It depends on what we're talking about in terms of the war. If you're thinking, for instance, let's say a cross-strait war, right, in Taiwan, which is the usual scenario we discussed. I think whether Europe engages and how it engages would hinge on a number of factors. First, if there is another war in Europe, or a imminent threat of war in Europe, that would constrain dramatically European military and political bandwidth to engage. Second, whether the United States engages directly or indirectly, a la Ukraine or Ukraine plus. Third, whether the war is confined to the Strait or it quickly spreads over into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, which provides more entry points for Europeans. Fourth, is it something quick, or is it something protracted and that extends over time? And again, that provides more entry points for Europeans in different ways, and it could be industrial enablement, or it can be also operational. That's a political decision. And then fifth, when does it happen? Does it happen in 2027, which is a date that's been thrown around a lot? Or does it happen in 10 years, when supposedly European defense spending would have picked up and there are more options, right? And then there are some options. Yeah, I mean, there's this narrative going around that there's nothing Europeans can bring to bear in the Indo-Pacific. I would disagree. I would disagree with that. But of course, there might be other priorities.
It's interesting. At the end of this panel, I would like us to touch on the China, Greenland, Arctic topic again, and I would also like us to discuss a little bit on the security economy nexus. But first, let us continue to talk more about what Luis just mentioned here. I mean, what can Europe offer in Asia and what can potentially Asia offer in the European theater? So do you foresee the Europeans contributing in the Asian theater?
I don't want to put people to sleep. So I think that the last discussion was real because we were not playing this what-if game. We were real in saying there are no two divisions going from UK to the Eastern Front. They're going to so the idea now we are talking from that to whether Europe going to fight in Indo-Pacific. We're going way off field here. So if we keep it real, I'm going to respond to two of my friends. So the idea of bifurcation and other stuff, the National Defense Strategy explicitly speaks to this. And I think speaks to this in a reasonable manner, according to me. Again, it will not go to the calling China-Russia axis, but it has a very important line. It says, American allies are all around and surround the Eurasian landmass. There's a very important line in there. And it also says, and goes away from this notion whether America itself can find one theater, two theaters simultaneously. Now it basically, whether agree or not disagree, it says, I want all American allies to be very competent around this Eurasian landmass. And what it means largely is that they need to be able to both absorb and react to the first strike before troops come in. America cannot be there all the time to say, I'm going to prevent the first strike. So you've got to have capacity. And the more important thing here is a really important thing that's been missed, is that the National Defense Strategy treats South Korea and Europe exactly the same way, which is a whole different ballgame. So before we get on the whole Indo-Pacific being different, it treats them exactly the same way. And it says both of them need to have, and need to have conventional deterrence in those places. Then we can talk about, and there's no mention that America is abrogating the nuclear or any other logistic or intelligence, but it does demand that conventional deterrence around the Eurasian landmass need to be there with the allies, number two. And then it does protect and save. Actually, the national defense and national security strategy both are more explicit in the first island change. They just say that is the importance, we need to get there, peace through strength, we need to maintain this. So that's the ballpark there is. We can discuss this. I do think that the place which is missed, and I do disagree this, with bifurcation others, because in the free north, the extension of free and open Indo-Pacific to the north, all three theaters come together. And there is no scenario in which America is fighting an Indo-Pacific war and is able to say, okay, I'm keeping my hands off of the North. Just like Richard said, there's no scenario where that is happening. That's the worst case scenario that French plays. It just can't happen because I'm not going to give up the North. If I gave up the North, it's a very easy flank for China to move in. Hence, Greenland matters. It really, really matters. And there's no way that America is going to subcontract American security to any other NATO member. That's just not in our own hemisphere. We won't do it. So these are the reality. Now the question my friend said about make China 2025, the Europe need to do it. Ain't happening. Because the reason China happened is a different world. China abused the WTO freedom to be able to make that. That is no longer the world we live in. And we haven't yet collectively defined what is the world that replaces WTO. In fact, the entire reason we are here is because so-called rules-based order, value-based stuff, this was an inadequate way to be able to respond both to China and Russia over the last 20, 30 years. That's where the conundrum where we are at. And what we haven't done, and America is as guilty as anybody else, that collectively we haven't come up and say, okay, what replaces the completely unfettered WTO? And it's not just, there you are right, it's not just a question of just decoupling or de-risking. We're basically going to move into a stratified economic system. There'll be very high priority, very sensitive issues where we will decouple. That's just the nature of the beast, whether it be high-end technology, whether it be defense. We'll just be decoupling it. There will be making furniture and toys. There will be full integration. There's no reason to decouple there. And in between, you'll have to determine, and this is back to my good friend's point on cars, whether we are doing a de-risking of sorts, whether we're just leaving the whole world to Chinese-made electric cars, or what the American and German car industry going to look, what's the solar panel industry, and that'll be in the middle, let's work it out of de-risking sides. There'll be a decoupling, de-risking, and integration. In that world, where none of us are that big, as you mentioned, again, collectively the G4 that I say, is more than 50% of global GDP. So by definition, you will have America, Europe, India, and Japan working more together, even if they say things. And here I will use a good friend, a great line from old Winston in Richard's honor. He had a fantastic, a man not shy of throwing barbs, but he says, if my barbs may sting, but I pray they do not fester. And so that's where we are with the US-Europe discussion. And for us, we have no other offer than that we stand stronger collectively. There really, whichever way you want to do it, there is no other alternative. And we need to strengthen together in that we are talking a lot about trust. The issue came up again and again here.
Of course, I think we should allow Øystein and Louise to come into the discussion as well. Øystein, there are a few things I know that you would like to respond to. So one thing is, I think we need to look at the Arctic thing. You're seeing that there are three theaters together: Europe, Asia, and the Arctic. I think Øystein differs on that, but then there is also the economic part. So I think, Øystein, you can respond to both.
And Indian Ocean, a very important theater.
So I think, I think it's too easy just to say, the Chinese will move into the Arctic. They built the biggest navy in the world in numbers of ships. They haven't sailed any warships in the Arctic. That just gives you an indication of their priorities. Their priorities is deterrence in their own region to, get the Americans further away from their mainland. That's priority one. And then you move into the Pacific, you move into the Indian Ocean. How do you get to the Arctic? You can ask a submariner like our Rear Admiral here, how do you get the Jin-class SSBN through the Bering Strait? 136 meters long. It can get stuck, The Chinese really don't want to get their SSBN stuck in the Bering Strait. So it's not like moving into the Arctic is like a real option for the Chinese right now. So one thing is having Trump talking about Chinese warships all around Greenland. There's nothing there. And you say, in the future they will come. I don't think so, because they have bigger fish to fry in all other regions closer to China. So the Arctic, first of all, the Bering Strait, is very difficult to deploy through because you have the St. Lawrence Island, you have the sonars, you have everything picking them up. You will even pick them up down in the first island chain once they enter into the Pacific. If you go the other route, you go through the Indian Ocean, through the Atlantic, and then up to Greenland. Wow, that's a very difficult operation. That will take a long time. And how are you going to sustain your operation there? You don't have any bases or places where you're going to have, Djibouti, that's very few places where the Chinese actually can operate. And in the Arctic, they have nothing, because 7 out of the 8 Arctic surrounding the Arctic is NATO countries. The US will never, ever allow China to have a base in Greenland. So I think this is very, very far-fetched, and I think we should stick to the reality and look at the data and look at what China are prioritizing, because it's not the Arctic. Second, on the Eurasian continent, we have a more sophisticated view on this. You say, we all have to have allies who can deter, but South Korea cannot deter China. Huh? But Europe can deter Russia. It's like a completely different, threat. The Russians doesn't pose the same threat to Europe as China posed to South Korea. So again, you have to look at the Eurasian landmass very, very differently. Third, the argument was never that Europe should come to a war over Taiwan. The argument was the opposite. If there is a war over Taiwan, That's the most dangerous situation we will face in Europe, because that gives Russia an opportunity to start a new war in Europe. So that's where we really need all our forces in Europe. And finally, on the 2025, you're right that China has benefited a lot from the US-led international order. But what I'm pointing to when I'm saying we need something like the 2025 plan in Europe is that we need some coordination. We need the more long-term strategic thinking that the Chinese do. We need the prioritization that they do. We need to do subsidies of really critical, like mineral, for instance. Why are Norway not, just putting the money you need to do Fensfeltet and bring out minerals, or other areas in Norway where you can have minerals? We are almost 100% depending on China for crucial rare earth minerals. To produce all the weapons that everyone has been talking about over the last 2 days, you cannot produce missiles, submarines, frigates without those minerals that you 100% rely on from China. So we need a long-term strategy in Europe to do these things, and it's not really about the WTO or whatever. It's about Europe taking that responsibility.
Two clarifications. Just for 1 minute.
But of course, before I give the floor to you, you will get your opportunity. But also
one finger rule for 1 minute.
Yeah. But also, I find it interesting if you look at the new Trump administration's national security strategy. If you look at the balance of power elements in it, which are quite strong, it means that the United States will try to contain China militarily. So if the United States really follows that strategy, China doesn't have the capabilities to operate in the Arctic or the Greenland. So actually, the Trump administration national security strategy tells us that China will not be in the proximity to Greenland.
Well, again, it's an assumption that you're right, China itself doesn't. So the assumption is, can China ride the coattails of Russia? So everything about the submarines, the bases, that's the assumption. Without it, I agree with you, but that's where we disagree very quickly on that. And also on the Korean thing, it's not that Korea should be responding deterrence to China, it's to North Korea. Just those two clarifications, then you can, that's it. Yeah. Other thing you can just,
Yeah.
Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, if I could just briefly comment on that. Well, first of all, I mean, I agree with Øystein on the Arctic, and I think the Admiral put it very well. Of course, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific strategic or geopolitical spaces blend at multiple spots, actually 3 mainly, right? You look at geography, it's basically the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, and Central Asia. The Arctic, I think, today is where that blending is least meaningful for the reasons we've laid out. It's more meaningful in the Indian Ocean, certainly from a European perspective, at least today. Central Asia, it brings up other factors. On South Korea, I actually would say that it's a little bit of both. You're right that it's primarily the threat referent is North Korea. So you said that the NDS gives the same treatment to Europe and South Korea. I would not say that. I would say a similar treatment, but not the same treatment, because South Korea, of course, offers many opportunities in the context of deterring China militarily because of where they are, and we know that the United States has tried to leverage the US-ROK alliances for purposes other than just deterring North Korea, and for right reasons, and it makes a lot of sense, and it seems to be moving slowly in that direction. So I would say similar treatment, not exactly the same. And then on whether Europe is going to fight in Asia or not. Look, this is a theoretical question. The bottom line is that we do not know. What I would say is that it's actually, and I think this is an important point to make, I think it's in Europe's interest that the US prioritizes the Indo-Pacific region, because that is where the main threat to US power, not just military, but US power, is coming from. And whether we like it or not, our way of life still revolves around many things, but the US power is an important one of them. So I think What's important is that we facilitate that and we do it in an orderly fashion while keeping some of the US involved here, which they will be interested in doing anyway, right? So that what's important is that we sequence it right and we do it in a coordinated fashion. I think whether the US wants Europeans to be involved or supportive in Asia or not will be an important factor determining whether Europeans engage or not, but ultimately that decision will be Europeans. Europeans have their own interests. And I'm talking particularly the British and the French, who are the only ones who have, well, maybe Norway as well, a capability to project some power to Asia. But as I said before, that will partly be determined as well by the situation in Europe, and in this case, in the High North, right? And
I think we are struggling with time, Luis.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll end there.
I give my time to him.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
No, but I think we will more or less close the panel. But I'm using my sort of misuse my position as chair. This is, I think, something really important for Norway and Europe going forward, working with China and collaborating with the US. If I just spend 30 seconds, because I think this is really, really important. There is a Chinese electrical vehicle company called Dongfeng that is planning to open a factory in Fredrikstad. It has been on the news. But the debate seems to be mainly about whether this factory is a threat to sort of Rygge airport or to the harbor in the vicinity of Fredrikstad. There has been very little debate about to what extent this is a good approach concerning European industrial policy, which is actually, to me, potentially even more important. So I think we have been discussing security issues related to China and Asia, but I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that industrial policy is a foundation for security. So we need also to keep that in mind. And with those words, I think we close the panel, and then I have the honor to give the floor to Grete Farmo, who is the board of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, to make a few words at the very end. So, please. We go down, yeah.
Thank you so much, and at least I'm the chair of the board. I'm not the complete board, just so you know. But I have the privilege to actually do something that I almost regret that I have to do, namely to close the Oslo Security Conference 2026. I've heard rumors, but it was stated clearly today among some of you that this is the best conference ever. We live in a very turbulent world, at least from a political perspective, and to have the privilege to listen to all the speakers that has been on this stage for the 2 days help us reflect, learn, consider, and maybe also have some real takeaways. And I must say, Admiral, that I'm concerned, but not afraid. I noted those words. I also, of course, have been thinking about what is the new normal. Change is the new normal, was stated by the Prime Minister. He also said it's profound. And then we heard today that actually the new normal is that decision makers face reality. Something to consider. And then it was said, who are we? We need to discuss that before we actually go into who's going to do what. Well, I leave you pondering upon these statements and then would like to use the opportunity to say a thank you not only to the panelists and speakers, also to you in the audience, but in particular to, and it was mentioned yesterday, to the Secretariat of the Atlantic Committee. It was also stated that it is a small secretariat. And how small? Well, you have already heard the Secretary General, so Kate Hansen-Bundt, please come up on stage. But she has only 3 people with her, Camilla, Anders, and Maya. Please join me on stage. Yeah, that was exactly it. That's exactly it. Yeah. Well, this round of applause was really yours. I'm proud to be on stage with you, but I'll leave now and let Kate say the final closing words, and those are really important because they have to do with food. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, to everyone, I would like to thank you for being part of this conference this year. And of course, to all the excellent speakers and the panelists, without you willing to take the trip to Oslo or joining the conference, it would have been no conference. And thank you to the University of Oslo. I feel like I've been given the Oscars. Thank you to the University of Oslo. I must remember to thank the technical team, Pixel, under Herman's steady leadership, who has provided us a good sound these 2 days. And thank you also to all the volunteers from our youth organization, Yata, who has been taking care of the logistics this year. And of course, my crew. Now it's time to reflect, but it's also time to get some food for the belly, not only for the thoughts. We are inviting you to a lunch in Domus Biblioteca, just where you got lunch yesterday and coffee today, for a closing, for closing these 2 days and have a little chat with all the others. So please follow me to Domus Biblioteca. Hope to see you here next year.